Well, this is Module 7. And in this module, I want to speak to the issue of winsomely advocating for conscience in healthcare. And really what I want to do is to help you to winsomely defend your ability to complete your medical education without violating your conscience. And so let me give you a little bit of background in this. Unfortunately, Western culture is increasingly dismissing the importance of the concept of conscience. And especially within healthcare, the ability to practice medicine according to conscience is increasingly viewed as a privilege rather than a necessity. And to understand why this is happening, again, it's important to go back to the foundational worldviews that we are dealing with today, both our created worldview as well as our accidental worldview. And again, in the created worldview, we look at the fact that everything around us is created, and because it is created, there is an inherent preset structure. There are also inherent values. And going against that preset structure or against those values brings harm to the individual. Another way of thinking of this is that looking at creation as a building. And when you enter a building, you have to find your way around, and if you just go blindly, you will run into walls and bring harm to yourself. And so the way to flourish within the created worldview is to conform yourself to those inherent values and that preset structure so that you find the best way to navigate. But in the accidental worldview, of course, the universe came into being by accident. Therefore, there are no inherent values, there is no preset structure. The universe is made up simply of raw material. And the only way to really flourish is to make use of that raw material in the best way that you know how. So when we apply the issue of conscience to both the Christian and the accidental worldview, here are some of the things that we find. We see that conscience is, in fact, a biblical term. In fact, Paul talks about his actions to strive to keep his conscience clear in Acts 24:16. Paul also talks about the fact that our conscience bears witness to what is right or wrong in Romans 2:15. And finally, Peter talks about the importance that we are actually commanded to keep a clear conscience in 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. But in the accidental worldview, the concept of conscience is ambiguous with varying importance. And in fact, we learn from 1 Timothy 4:2, where Paul writes that continued disobedience to God's commands will cause a searing of the conscience and a loss of ability to really contact and be aware of our conscience. And this loss of conscience among individuals that will then cause an overall devaluation of conscience in others. And that's what we're seeing in healthcare today. So, some presuppositions regarding conscience in the Christian worldview. Well, conscience is not only to be highly valued, we are commanded to maintain a clear conscience before God. And again, first century Christians, when threatened with death, if they did not give some type of worship to Caesar, still refused to do that and were therefore killed in order that they may maintain a clear conscience. Thirdly, we need to recognize that failure to maintain a clear conscience before God will bring harm to us as Christians. That harm includes a loss of fellowship with God. And in addition, it may bring what we call moral distress and moral injury. And so ignoring our conscience is not without its consequences. But on the other hand, we need to recognize that conscience is fallible. It's not perfect. We are not perfect beings. And because we are fallen, our conscience is fallen. And an example of this is really Job, who was clearly known in the Old Testament to be a person who was righteous and wise. But yet, he had a limited understanding and recognized that he did not have perfect understanding in Job 42, 1-6. So we have to work as Christians to renew and strengthen our conscience through the study of Scripture, so that our overall goal with the conscience and following our conscience is not only to be obedient to God, but to really avoid any complicity with evil. So, presuppositions in terms of those that have an accidental worldview? Well, as I've mentioned, view of conscience varies between having peripheral importance all the way to having no value whatsoever. Within medicine, the conscience of the healthcare professional should be sublimated to the autonomy of the patient. Therefore, the assertion of conscience freedoms within healthcare should be accorded little, if any, priority. So there are several forms of conscientious refusal in healthcare. First, we may recuse ourselves from participation in a procedure or plan of care without abandoning the patient. We may refuse to disclose certain information. For example, recent laws in the state of California and the state of New Mexico were forcing healthcare professionals to talk about the issue of assisted suicide whenever their patient had a terminal diagnosis that may cause them to live 6 months or less. We at CMDA fortunately fought successfully against those laws, but in your particular educational setting, you may be forced to speak to patients about the issue of abortion or about the issue of gender transition or whatever, and you may be put into a position where you have to refuse to disclose that information. Lastly is the issue of effective referral. And this really is the referral to another clinician or a facility that you know will engage in the act or intervention that you are refusing to participate in. And this is ultimately an individual decision, but I will say to you that many of our members look at effective referral as a form of complicity with evil. So how do Christian healthcare professionals winsomely defend their conscience freedoms in this increasingly hostile medical environment? Well, there are several steps that I would encourage you to take. First, I would encourage you to make sure that you have thought deeply about the issue and that confirming that there is a biblical reason for you to refuse to engage in either the action or intervention or discussion about it. And one of the resources that I would highly recommend to you is our CMDA position statements, which you can find online, and they deal with over 90 different topics. And they have been worked through with a laborious process, beginning with Christian bioethicists and theologians spending months putting together the initial statement that is then vetted and reviewed by the CMDA Board of Trustees and the CMDA House of Representatives. They are thorough and biblically founded and an excellent resource for you. The second thing I would recommend along this line is to educate yourself on a particular issue, especially those issues that come up without any warning that we don't have a position statement on. An excellent example of this is the vaccines for COVID-19. And I don't want to look and address the issue of safety or efficacy, but I know that there were many questions raised about the ethical nature of those vaccines. And one of the things that I saw in my interaction with various people around the country is that the healthcare professional hadn't educated themselves on the basis of their conscientious refusal to take these vaccines because they were simply aware that it was due to some association with abortion-derived fetal cell lines. And it's unfortunate if you're really going to take a stand, it's incumbent on you to educate yourself, and using this as an example, on, for instance, what is that abortion-derived fetal cell line? You can do research on that, on HEK 293, for instance. How was the original abortion done? What is the degree of association between that abortion and the vaccines that are being produced today? And also, is there any other usage of the HEK 293 abortion-derived fetal cell line today? It turns out that this cell line is utilized in many additives, in foods, in terms of sweeteners, in terms of other flavoring. There's also cosmetics that are utilizing these abortion-derived fetal cell lines. So if you're going to refuse to take a vaccine that has a very limited association, you need to consider whether or not you're going to also avoid these other products. So all of that to say that it's critical, especially in view of new ethical dilemmas, that it's incumbent on you to educate yourself about all of the aspects of that ethical dilemma as you can. Second, I would say that it's important for you to spend considerable time in prayerful meditation to make sure of your conscience, especially when it comes to unusual or unclear situations. And third, I think it's always wise to approach other believers, especially those that are older, been walking with the Lord longer, to gain their wisdom and perspective on the issue that you are facing. But if you have, after all of these steps, decided to make a stand in terms of some type of conscientious refusal, then here are some suggestions of practical things that I would suggest you do ahead of time. You first of all want to prepare in advance of what you're going to say. You want to have a clear declaration of what your conscience will allow and what it will not allow. Always maintain a proper attitude of humility and respect for all persons as well as the people you are talking to. Because you want to remember that the greatest command we have from our Lord is the command to love, not only Him, but others as ourselves. It's important to frame your faith as an integral part of your life and express your belief that God leads you in part through your conscience, but don't try to expand on that because it's unlikely to be understood. I think it's very good to express your strong sense of responsibility to be obedient to the Lord whenever possible, but also respectfully acknowledge and emphasize the reality of the harm that results when someone is forced to go against their conscience, specifically talking about the issue of moral distress, which occurs when someone's conscience is threatened, and moral injury, which occurs when someone is forced to go against their conscience. Then conclude your discussion with a declaration of your willingness to be as flexible as possible in working through the situation so that you are able to obey your conscience and yet be fair to your fellow classmates or residents. So at this time, I would encourage you to, again, stop the video and imagine the following scenario where a friend or a colleague comes to you and says, "Why is obeying your conscience so important to you?" Work through that scenario and come up with the answers that best fit where you are. In the second part of this video, I want to deal with a slightly different question, and that is, how should you respond if your initial request to refuse a procedure, intervention, or whatever is refused? The first thing I would do is to respectfully ask if there is someone in higher authority that you can go to and express your concerns and your conscientious objection. Secondly, if the person in highest authority also refuses to honor your request, I believe your next step should be to return to the Lord in prayer, confirming His will for you in this particular situation. And so to do that, you can respectfully ask for additional time to think over the matter. And then again, consider seeking advice from other Christians, especially those who have walked a long time with the Lord. But if after prayer and consultation with others, you are continuing to feel led to continue in your conscientious refusal, then you need to mentally prepare yourself for the possible consequences. You could easily be penalized, maybe even terminated from your position. I would suggest that you begin gathering around you a prayer group and support system and inform them of your decision to proceed and asking for prayer. In addition, that should include family members, church, and Christian group, as well as CMDA. Now, dealing with various potential outcomes is beyond the scope of this curriculum, but I will say to you that we are in the process of putting together legal resources for you that are at no cost, specifically if you are in a situation where your conscientious refusal has not been granted. And I would ask you contact us at CMDA at advocacy@cmda.org. So now spend some time role-playing a situation in which you are expected to refer patients for a procedure, and in other words, to engage in effective referral. Begin thinking about situations in which you would be willing to risk everything and how you would respond in that particular situation.